Welcome back to another episode of Health is Wealth. And thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. And as always, I am beyond grateful and thankful from the bottom of my heart for each and every one of you who's tuning into today's episode and also tuning in to help support the podcast. As every week, I am sharing a new episode, just sharing words and thoughts of hopes, inspiration, and motivation, to hopefully bring value into your life today. Just things that I am learning and understanding on my own journey on this crazy ride that we call life. So thank you once again for tuning in. And what I wanted to talk to you about this week was really asking this big question. And it probably should be one of the most important questions we ask ourselves today, right? And it's, who are you? Who are we? And as I ask this question, this is coming from a point of myself right now, of where I'm at in life. Beginning of October, I turned 40 years old. And so as I think about turning 40, I think about entering this new decade, a new season of life. And so it's definitely been a lot on my mind recently as to what does this mean, right, for me? What does this next season and decade of my life look like as I am getting older, as, the things that I'm thinking about, are different than what they were 10 years ago and so forth. And that comes a lot to, think about when it comes to exactly who am I? What do I stand for? What are my beliefs? What's my image, right? What am I putting out into the world? What's my message, right? And so it's a big question to ask because I think if we're not intentional about the person that we are building and who we are and what we are becoming, then we might end up becoming someone we might not want to be and didn't realize we're creating. And it's very important, especially as I find getting older, to really identify this new season of maturity of life and what it really means to me. What are my values? The next 10 years, what are the most important things to me? What are the things I need to focus and put my energy into, right? What are my beliefs about stuff? What are my values that I've got towards things? And, what direction in life am I truly heading? And so, again, I think it's a very important question to ask at any stage in life because through every, season in life, we're always growing, the stages of where we are at and what's going on in our life are always changing. And so I think it's always important to reevaluate, who we are today and, how different that was from so many years ago to where we are now and how that's going to change going forward. And so, it's an exciting thing for me to think about because, it's really just coming into my 40s, now, I think there's a lot that's got to change in my life. There's a lot of, things that I have to take a lot more seriously, right? Things that really are going to need my focus and energy and priority in. And a lot of that, again, really stems around asking myself, well, who am I? What am I trying to accomplish in life? How do I perceive myself? What does the world perceive me as, And all those things come down from the things that I think about, the things that I talk about, how I treat people, how I respond to things. I mean, even to the physical appearance, how I dress, how I move, how I conduct myself, my body language, like all sorts of different things come to mind as I think about this. Who am I? Who is Steven in this phase of life? And who do I want to be 5 years from now and 10 years from now? Because I'm only getting older and not younger. And so as I get older, that definition of who I am is going to continue to evolve and change as I grow in maturity, as I grow in seasons in life, as every new season, brings new change for things that are going to be important, things that are going to matter. How I think about myself is going to matter. How, I believe the world and people see me is going to matter and all of that. So, if it's not a question you've asked yourself recently, take a few minutes today maybe and just ask yourself, like, who are you? What do you represent? What do you stand for? What do you believe in? What matters to you in life? What things do you find value in? What things matter to you? What things are your priority? How do all those kind of things say about the kind of person that you are inside and out? And even to the way we dress and talk and think and feel, and all of that can really come down to this bigger question. And again, I really believe that being intentional about this is so that we have that ability to really create the identity of who we want to be. Because so often in life, we're just flowing, right? We don't really pay attention to who we are, those beliefs, what that means to our life and the direction of life that we're going, and what it means to people around us and society in this world. And then oftentimes we might find ourselves, becoming someone that we really didn't want to be. Or maybe at some point in life it was once us. But, if we don't reevaluate and ask, is this still what we believe in? Is this still who we want to be? Is this still who we are? Then we might realize that we don't want to be that same person anymore. And I myself have gone through many seasons of this in life, for sure, knowing that I've changed, so many different things about my, not just personality, but, just the way I am, who I am, the things that I'm into, the things that I believe in, the way I present myself and all of that. And as I find myself getting older, I find my ways of thinking about these kind of things maturing as well, to be honest with you. Because, as someone who's now in my 40s, I want things in my life to reflect just that. Someone who is older, somebody who's, matured a lot, became more responsible, someone who's got a real handle on his priorities and beliefs and core values in life. And I want that to seep out through me and out into this world, through every bit of being, to show that I've matured in life, to show that, I've really got a new take with, what things really do matter, because it really does change what I was 20 years ago, the things I believed in, who I thought it was, the image I portrayed by how I talked, by how I acted, by how I dressed, by how I interacted, is far different than who I am today. And you could see it if you went back in time and saw me 20 years ago, And so as I've grown up so much more though now, you just begin to realize in every new season with growth, things do change. What I think about now is far different than what I thought about then. How I act now is far different than how I acted then. The things that are important to me now are far different than what mattered and what were important back then. And, as I'm in that new season of life, it's the biggest question I can ask myself today to really help mold what the next 10 years are going to look like for me. Because, if God has it and it's in my plan and hopefully so, right? 10 years from now, I'm going to look back and think about the decisions I'm making today with who I am, how I present myself to this world, this image I have of myself into this world, just ultimately everything about me. And I'm going to have to sit with those thoughts and be like, did I make the right choices? Did I become the right version of myself? Was I going down the right track? And I talk about this so often, right? That obviously, I'm what really matters to me, as far as impressing people is impressing, my loved ones and family, right? I want them to be proud of me. I want them to be proud of who I am and what I represent and all of these different things. And outside of that, though, the two people that I really want to impress the most is the younger version of me and the older version of me. And, as I get older, I really want to impress that older version of me, knowing that when I get there, I can look back and be like, you really showed a lot of maturity and responsibility in your age, in your season of life, making certain decisions, going down certain paths, because I'm ultimately going to have to answer to it 10 years from now on who I became then. So everything about who I am and who I'm asking myself who I want to be today is going to carve that path of who I become 10 years from now. And so these are a lot of things that are on my mind. 10 years from now, I'm going to be 50 years old. It is so crazy to think how time flies like that. 10 years ago, I was 30, right? And it's like that last decade flew by. So knowing that I'm going to be 50 in 10 years, if again, it's in God's will and hopefully God, right? I've got many, many more years left. I've got to really ask myself, what does this next 10 years going to look like for me? When I get into my 50s, what is this next 10 years going to look like? What things did I dedicate my time and effort and energy and focus on, right? How much was I able to mature in life with the things that really matter, the things that didn't, the things I put my time into, the passive directions of things that I focused on? There's so many different things like that I try to evaluate right now about what's important to me. The financial and time freedom of me and my loved ones, right? Retirement in the future, and what's the game plan going forward, and what's work going to look like, and building legacies and building a brighter future, and just so many different things to come in life. And so there's so many questions to ask myself, and there's a lot of that, again, that really just comes down to the basics, which is, who am I, And I really try to think about this in such a way of, like, again, what do I want to symbolize in life? What's my message? Everything inside and out of me, what is it telling the world about me? What am I telling myself? And I truly believe it is the most important question we can ask ourselves today, because hopefully you stand for something good. Hopefully you're trying to build that better, best version of yourself. And as I do mature in life, going the next 10 years, I have a lot of thoughts about how, I'm approaching this, What kind of man do I want to be like? What kind of man do I want to look like, right? What kind of man do I want to present myself in life with? And I know as I grow older, I believe my faith and my walk in faith is going to grow even stronger. And I want to do my best to try to embody, the image of God in every way possible, in my life with just, how I appear and how I speak and how I think and how I feel and how I treat others and the things that I care and support and love and where I put my time and energy and focus and just overall this image of good, right? And so it's a very important question, and it's really interesting how when you start to get older, you can really feel and sense these changes of, I guess, maturity and seasoning in your life. How these things really start to matter that much more for me, I mean, you think about stuff like that, when you're younger, but there's something about now just hitting this next era of me turning 40 and just really asking myself, who am I? Who's Steve James Quiroga at the core? What am I in this world? What am I to people around me? What am I to my loved ones? What does that say about who I am to me and to them and to everybody around? And am I proud of that person? Are they proud of that person? Is that someone that they could look at and be like, that's a good man there? There's so many things that are far more important than a lot of other things, because I know at its core, it's going to shape the reality of the life that I live, of the people that are around me, of the things and message that I put out there, and just so many more things. And so, again, I think it's very important, because if we're not careful with who we are building and creating, we again may just turn out to be someone we may not like, didn't realize we were creating. And so it's good just to be aware and intentional and ask yourself today, who are you? And most importantly, are you proud of that person that you are? Could you look back 5 years from now, looking at yourself today, be proud of you? Can you look 5 years ahead and be like, are we still going to be the same person? Do you want to still be the same person? Or do you want to change into somebody else? And like I said, you should never have to worry about re-identifying yourself in the world too. I've gone through so many different phases in life and seasons and chapters of just everything, from how I look to how I dress to how I act to how I talk to how I think to the image I portray. And it's only really been refined and defined as I've gotten older and more mature, that it's really made, me more aware, more conscious of everything about what I'm saying to this world, about who I am and what I represent and all of that. And it's a very important question that I'm, again, asking myself a lot right now as I look into the next 10 years and really just ask myself, who am I in this next 10 years of life? What does that version of me look like? So again, one of the biggest questions that we can ask ourselves today is, who are we? Are we happy with who we are? Are we going to change, 5 years from now? Can we look back and be happy or be proud of who we are today? again, looking forward, is that going to change? So, definitely a great question to ask yourself if you haven't. Again, for me, just turning 40, it's a big question that is on my mind and something I think about all the time. And it just really makes me be aware of certain decisions, certain paths that I'm on, certain, images or, things that I'm portraying and messages to the world, because they're really going to refine what I see myself as, who I am, what the world sees me as, what people around me sees me as. And maybe it's because I am getting older. A lot of these things are definitely maturing in just my mindset about how I think about these, because, it's only going to continue to get that way in another 10 years when I turn 50. And I just want to make sure that I'm going down a path that when I'm 50, I can be proud of and still be, proud of at that point and continue to grow and mature on those different levels in life. So thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. And as always, I will see you on the next one.